Good morning. Hey, if we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name's Dan, and I'm the lead pastor here, and I'm excited for the series that we've been in. You've picked a good time to join us. We're talking about relationships, how we can build resilient relationships in the world around us, and that covers, the things we're talking about covers everything from intimate family relationships, romantic relationships, all the way to like loose coworker relationships, and how do we navigate those? How do we build healthy relationships? When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, mostly 90s, I know, you can't tell, but I did, and it was a weird time to grow up in the church, honestly. It was probably one of the weirdest times to grow up in the church, because we had what was called the Christian bubble, and thankfully that's mostly burst. But the Christian bubble is a way that we operated as Christians in the world, where we created our own versions of things. We had Christian bookstores. We had Christian pop music, not just worship music. Like, I love worship music has always been produced by the church, like it just always has in one way or another. But this is like Christian pop music. It's like regular music, but it doesn't swear, okay? And then that produced Christian radio, which produced Christian DJs. We had Christian television. We had, like, just, you name it, we developed a Christian version of it. And there could be a lot of reasons for it. Some of it was for very good reasons. But what my perception of it, and you can disagree with me, you can argue with me about this, it's okay. I actually don't have to be right on this, but I am offering you my perspective as somebody who grew up in that Christian bubble, is some of the words that I heard describing the reason behind them. And the main word that I heard for the reason for the Christian bubble was offense. The world is incredibly offensive. Right? Like, that's what I was hearing. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm saying that's the message I grew up hearing. And the world is offensive. We don't like the way they talk. We don't like the way they act. We don't like the things they do. And so we have to create this bubble, and that bubble serves to separate us from what is Christian from what is not. Unfortunately, what a bubble also does is it separates you. You see, that's what offense ultimately does. Offense ultimately separates people. And it can explode into something bigger. It can result in shying away, but however it manifests, offense separates. Now, here's the problem. That's just one relationship where offense takes place, and the result of it is now the church has no say in the rest of the world. Not because we need power, not because we need control, but because we've chosen to let offense separate us from the people God has called us to love. It kind of kills the mission of the church, doesn't it? Now, that's just one relationship. Offense does this in all sorts of relationships in life. When I become offended about something, it drives me away from somebody else. I don't like what they did. You see, an offense is when somebody crosses a line with you or me. Like, we don't like something that somebody did. We don't like what they said. We don't like how they acted. And here's the real pressure, the insidious nature of offense is offense doesn't necessarily mean somebody did something wrong. It just means you didn't like it. Offense becomes this, not just a bubble, not just a separation, but it becomes a wedge. In fact, we have an image of how offense looks that we'll put up on the screen for you. And offense becomes this wedge within relationships. A wedge that starts small. At the point of the wedge, it's very small. It's a small thing. But the more that we wrestle with the thing that happened, that event, the offensive moment, it becomes larger because we begin to do what shame expert Brene Brown calls the stories we tell ourselves. We start building a story around why the person did what they did, what they think about us, and offense turns into this moment and this emotion in us that becomes bigger than the event itself. And now we can't ever draw close to that person because we have something that has just emerged out of the ground and it pushes us apart. Offense causes us to lean out of relationship. It doesn't cause us to lean into relationship. Have you ever gotten into an argument with somebody? That's a moment of collision. right? That's a moment where we're butting heads, where my will is against yours, and we're going to have it out now. But offense works more subtly because it doesn't cause us to butt heads. It causes us to lean away, and it creates distance. Well, how many of you are aware that you cannot have a healthy relationship? It doesn't work. It can't happen. You cannot build a resilient relationship when offense is present. So what we want to find out this morning is we want to go into God's Word. We want to dig into the Bible, and we want to see what God would have us understand about offense, and especially what offense produces in us, which is most characteristically known as anger. And what do we do with that so that we can build healthier relationships? Last week, we were in the letter from one of Jesus' followers, James, and we're going to be back there again today. So if you want to open up to James chapter 1, we're going to be in verses 19 through 20. James 1, 19 through 20, just a short little phrase, says this: "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." Now, as we unpack this, it's going to be a short unpacking, and we're going to visit a couple of other shorter scriptures as we walk through. But James has some incredibly important advice. And the advice that he gives us starts with brothers and sisters, my dear brothers and sisters. James is writing to a group of people who all believe Jesus, all believe in God. They believe that Jesus is who he said he is. And it's written to expand to all the people that believe in Jesus but are spread out across the world as James knew it at the time. There had been persecution rising up against the church, and so James writes this letter to encourage followers of Jesus to understand and what to do, what is right and what is good, and now he addresses them as brothers and sisters. He addresses them in a familial way, in a relational way. This is relationship that James is talking about. And the very first thing he says is, I want you to pay attention. I want you to listen closely because there's something you need to be aware of. There's something you need to do. And James says the first thing you need to do is be quick to listen. Now, this is increasingly difficult in our world. Listening is a lost art. Listening is something we all desire, but it's difficult for us to give. We live in a world where posting our opinion or shooting from the hip about what we believe has never been easier. We could just rattle it off. We live in a world where our voice is all equal. We don't even elevate published voices anymore because everybody's voice can be published. It can all be put out there, and all voices are elevated at the same level. And in a day and age when it's never been easier to voice our opinions, our needs, and our concerns, we have never had less listening. Think about that. We are speaking more than ever and listening less than ever. And James would caution us, he would encourage us, and he would say, first be quick to listen. That's something we're going to have to learn to do. But then he gives a couple of other directions. He says, slow to speak and slow to become angry. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Now, despite what it might seem when I'm on stage, I actually don't talk a whole lot in relationships. I'm very good with uncomfortable silence. Like, if you want to be my friend, you should probably learn just to sit quietly with me, and we'll be best friends. Right? I like that. There's something beautiful in that. Not that we shouldn't ever talk, but I remember just rattling off stuff when I was younger, and I would just always speak my thoughts. I would always speak my opinions, and then I would increasingly find out where I was wrong, arrogant, and misunderstood. Well, I didn't like that. And so I started going to the wisdom of God's Word and realized that there's actually a lot of wisdom in holding your tongue. And so I started teaching myself to be quieter. People started thinking I was a lot smarter than I was after that. They're like, that guy doesn't talk much. But when he does, he usually has something good to say. Now, I've kind of tempered that, and I've let some really stupid things fly out of my mouth since then as well. There's balance, right? We always have to have balance and moderation. But James would say, be slow to speak. And last week we just talked about speech as well, the importance of communication in a relationship. James would say you have to be slow to speak, and especially slow to become angry. Now, when James is concerned with the speech, the words that come out of our mouth, he's particularly concerned with the anger that drives those words. Not just any speech, because there is a time to speak and a time to be silent. But when we speak, James would also caution us and say, be slow to anger. We have to be slow with our anger. Now, everybody is angry. Like, that just seems like the cultural way things are. We all have anger. I just want to burst your bubble for just a moment if you're holding on to this. You will never be free from anger. You will always have, at some level, anger. You will never be free from anger. It will always be a present reality in your life and some level of your personality. And you might be able to say to me, but Dan, I'm not an angry person. I'm actually incredibly laid back. No, that's fine. You just take anger and you internalize it. Everybody's angry. Everybody experiences anger at some time. Now, I'm not saying everybody's stomping around, throwing a fit. I'm saying everybody, everywhere, experiences the emotion of anger. You will never not have anger. But James says, be slow to be angry. And then he gives a why behind it. As he writes in verse 20, he says, because. This is his why. Why should we be slow to speak and slow to become angry? He says, because human anger, and now this is where James focuses in on what's inside. Human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Now, there's a few things we need to hold on to here. Number one, James talks about human anger. Human anger doesn't produce the righteousness God desires. Well, that lets me know something. Number one, there is a way to be angry that is righteous. There is a way to be angry that produces God's righteousness. And it also lets me know something else. God gets angry. If it's in us at some level, doesn't mean it's always good, but I think the things that will always be there, the things that are just inherent in being human, are at some level a reflection, and not a perfect reflection, and not usually a holy reflection, but a reflection of what we see in the character of God. If human beings are created in the image of God, and anger is present, but anger can produce a righteousness. That means that there is a characteristic of God that experiences anger. Now, there's a difference. James says human anger doesn't produce the righteousness of God, but we have to slow down for a second and understand righteousness. Righteousness is not about following the rules. Righteousness is not actually being moral. Righteousness doesn't have anything to do with how good you are, and that's oftentimes how we think about righteousness, especially when we talk about it in kind of a negative, pejorative connotation, where it's like we often might think about somebody else as being self-righteous, and what we mean by that is they think they're better than everybody else. But while that serves to express some kind of opinion or observation, that's not actually the Bible's understanding of righteous. Because just as James starts by addressing brothers and sisters, righteousness is also a relational term. Righteousness has to do with being in right relationship with people and with God. That's what it means to be righteous, to be in right relationship with others and with God. Righteousness also has a connotation of justice. When relationship is broken or somebody has carried out some sort of injustice, it's always a relational thing. It's in relationship to something, and righteousness is the corrective action. It's the justice-oriented action to fix the brokenness that has happened in relationship. So there's this understanding, James would say, about righteousness, that God produces a righteousness that creates right relationship. And when there is injustice, when there is brokenness in relationship, we might even think about it when there is an offense, there is a way There is a perspective that God has. If God becomes angry in one of those moments, it produces right relationship. Can you imagine that? Every time I get mad, it doesn't work that way. Every time I get frustrated, every time I react out of anger, it actually drives that wedge deeper between the relationship. That's exactly what James is talking about. If righteousness doesn't have to do with our goodness, our morality, it certainly has tangential meaning there, right? To be in right relationship with somebody, I live a certain way. To be in right relationship with God, I live a certain way. So it includes those aspects, but righteousness is about being in right relationship. James says that human anger, the way you and I react when we get angry or offended, does not fix relationships. Now, I've shared before, but if you're newer with us or you haven't heard this before, I've always struggled with confrontation. I had a problem with confrontation growing up. I always just assumed that avoiding confrontation was the best method. Like, just let it go, and we'll see how it works out in the details later on. It didn't usually work out so well, right? Like, you can imagine that, avoiding confrontation for you avoiders, it doesn't work out so well. It just defers the problem. But I had to learn how to confront. I had to learn how to be confrontational. And through it, I went through a process of figuring out what can drive me into confrontation when I don't want to deal with it. And it turns out it was anger. It was very empowering to feel angry, and so I would go and confront somebody out of anger while I was still charged up, while the adrenaline was still high, and I still had that desire to go in and really blast the person. Then I could do conflict. The problem was that wasn't working out so well either. What I had to learn over time was how to have healthy conflict resolution, how to let the anger pass, but then there's this other aspect of anger that's earlier on. We might be able to get rid of the anger, but then there's still this aspect of offense. When somebody crosses the line with you, even before it comes anger, it can be an incredible driver for us. Unfortunately, that driver tends to drive us apart in relationship. And so James cautions us, and he says, everyone should be slow to speak, slow to anger, because all of those things aren't going to produce a right relationship. In fact, they drive us farther apart from one another. What we need to do, what we need to learn, is we need to learn how to deal with these emotions, because we're never going to be free from anger. We need to learn how to deal with offense. We need to learn how to deal with the issues of anger in a way that actually leads us into better relationship. I mean, just think about it for a moment. It might even be the smallest offense, but those are areas of relationship that you avoid with other people. Maybe somebody said something you didn't like. Maybe somebody included you in something you didn't want to be included in, or maybe they excluded you from something you wanted to be included in. Maybe somebody did something that violated your space. Whatever it might be, we have all sorts of places that offense can begin to wedge its way in between relationships. And when we're not understanding, when we're not aware of the process, offense quickly turns into a story that we create in our own minds about why that person intentionally did that thing to violate me. It becomes anger, and now I want nothing to do with that person. When I'm unaware of it, I realize that I've held on to offenses that are years old, and they are the places within relationship that I do not interact with another person. In specific relationships that I've had, I've become offended by people and decided that is an off-limits area of that relationship. I don't want to be offended. I get angry when I'm offended, so I'm just going to avoid that area. More often than not, offense drives the wedge. It leads to anger, and that anger is either suppressed or it's expressed, often in an unhealthy way. And James speaks to us, and he says everyone should be slow to anger, slow to speak, because human anger, the thing we're about to do in that moment, is not going to help a relationship, on the other side of that emotion, on the other side of that feeling, is nothing good for that relationship. Oftentimes when we pursue that, it just drives the wedge deeper. So what we actually have to learn to do, we have to learn how to do something that's in God's character, that only God can do. You and I, we have to learn how to let God deal with our anger. You and I have to learn, we have to learn to let God deal with our anger. You have to learn to let God deal with your anger. And I think almost inevitably, and I could be wrong, but almost inevitably, offense leads to anger. We get upset about something, we don't like something, and it leads down the path to anger. And we kind of like anger because it feels empowering. It feels way better than sitting in offense, so we latch on to anger. They're companions. But the problem is, we don't know how to deal with our anger. Not in a way that draws people together, only seems to reinforce the wedge of offense. But what you and I can do is we can learn to let God deal with our anger. We can learn a part of God's character that creates righteous relationships, right relationships with other people. We see this in God's character. We see it in Jesus. If we want to become people who are looking more like Jesus, we have to understand that Jesus was never offended by anybody. He wasn't ever caught off guard by the way people acted. He wasn't caught off guard when somebody betrayed him. In fact, he had it so Jesus, if you didn't know this, Jesus had a few close followers. He had crowds that followed him. He had a few close followers, and out of those close followers, he had just a small 3 people that were the closest to him. And one of his inner circle, you know how long it takes to develop your inner circle. The people you would share anything with, the people that you trust with your life, with any secret. One of those people in Jesus' life denied him. Jesus wasn't offended. He actually knew it was going to happen. He kind of pre-forgave the offender. He even told the offender, this is what you're going to do. When you come back, I'll be here for you. Nothing offended Jesus. Now, Jesus did express anger, but his anger was always restorative. It always fixed relationships, either between people and God or one another. He always had a righteous anger, though never offended. You and I can learn that aspect of God's character, and we can allow it to refine our character. We can allow it to strengthen our relationships. I think if we can learn to become unoffendable, we can start to have healthier, resilient relationships. The easiest way to deal with offense is actually to start learning to deal with anger. And I think everybody can deal with anger. They can learn how to let God deal with their anger if we follow just a few things. The first one is to slow down. That's what James tells us. He says, be quick to listen, right? That's like a positive spin on stop talking so much. And then he says 2 slow words. Slow to speak, slow to anger. The first thing we have to do is we have to slow down. Most of the time we grab onto offense, we start spinning a story in our minds, and we allow it to drive us forward in the relationship. We start making assumptions that we already wanted to believe are true. We're empowered by the anger, and we do something with it. We allow it to drive us out of the relationship in some way. When I pick up on, I'm a pretty sensitive person. I've had to deal with that over the years, the negative parts of being sensitive. There's certainly good parts, there's negative parts. But one of the things I had to do is pay attention to my sensitivity, because I can walk into a room, and many people can do this, it's nothing unique, but I can walk into a room and you can notice a shift in somebody's behavior, right? And I'm pretty good at causing that shift, so I'm pretty aware of when it happens. I say something or I do something, and I upset maybe somebody in my family, and I realize there's been a shift in their body language and their posture and how they're interacting with me, and I start paying attention to it. And if I'm not careful, I start spinning a story and I run with it. But if I do pay attention, I have a moment to slow down and not let it control me. You see, you can't change whether you are the recipient of offense. But here's the thing. In offense, there's an offender and there's the offended. Where does the offense lie? Within the offended. The offender doesn't feel offense. You do. I do. So what we have to do is we have to pay attention to those feelings. We have to pay attention to that moment of offense, and we have to slow down so that it doesn't become a controlling factor driving us into an aspect of relationship that we don't want to be in. Now, this is even easier. This is harder to do, slowing down, when you have less relationship. The looser that relationship is, the easier it is to latch on to offense. The closer that relationship is, the more important it is to slow down. How many relationships have gone away from each other by small, manageable offenses? The smallest thing can reduce us. It can separate friends. It can cause divisions, all sorts of silly things because we didn't slow down. Now, when we talk about slowing down, there's a few things we want to slow down to pay attention to because we don't always name things the way they are at first. We might not look at that and say that's offensive. We might not look at that and say I'm angry. But there's usually a few things that are happening within us. There's a few symptoms, usually physical. And so we're going to put a little list up on the screen. And these are some symptoms of anger. It might not be all the symptoms, but there are some symptoms for sure that are pretty common. One is your stomach gets in knots. Sometimes we might call it anxiety. Anxiety and anger have a very fine line between the two. Stomach in knots, clenched teeth. I remember a guy that I was meeting with for coffee, and he attended the church that we were at several years ago. And I remember he wanted to talk about leadership in the church, and he had some ideas. And his ideas were really good. The guy was pretty talented. He could speak. He could do all sorts of stuff that kind of fits within the walls of the church. But as I was meeting with him, I recognized that he had worn down teeth on either side of his middle two teeth. And I noticed that as I was watching him, whenever he'd get angry, he'd start grinding his teeth. And even though he was probably a very, very talented individual, I thought, I think you have too much anger to be in the position that God would like to put you in. Because you won't be able to manage those relationships. You won't be able to be within those relationships. Clenched teeth, just grinding them. Rapid heartbeat. One of the first things that happens in me when I'm getting upset about something, my heart rate elevates. Adrenaline starts pumping through my body. Blood rushing to your face. You ever get red in the face when you're angry or upset? Those are all symptoms that your body is telling you need to slow down. You need to breathe. You need to pause, and you need to choose to not act in that moment. Don't start telling yourself a story. Don't start reacting. Don't start doing anything, because whatever's on the other side of that is not beneficial for a right relationship. So slow down. The next part of what can help us learn to let God deal with our anger is to learn to give God whatever we're dealing with. We have to prayerfully give it to the Lord. Prayerfully give it to the Lord. And this is what I mean. It sounds simplistic, but what I'm talking about is recognizing that whatever you produce coming on the heels of offense or anger is not going to help the relationship. Offense and anger causes a reaction in us that says, I have to defend myself. Now, the problem with that sentiment is that when we say I have to defend myself, it comes from a belief of because nobody else will. And the problem with that is when we believe that nobody else will defend us, we're actually saying, I have to defend myself because even God won't defend me. I have to deal in anger because nobody else is going to do anything about this situation, so I have to take matters into my own hands. The problem with this is that our anger doesn't produce the righteousness of God because you and I don't have the perspective God has. We don't have the power to actually change hearts, minds, situations. We don't know people's intentions. We create a story in our minds that at best is usually half true. So we have to slow down, sense when something is happening in us, and we have to prayerfully give it over to the Lord. Now, the best way to do this is what the Bible calls being still. In Psalm 46:10a, the author says, he says, referring to God, be still and know that I am God. If you read through Psalm 46, you're going to recognize that this is a very interesting passage. We use it all the time for prayer. We use it all the time for just general stillness. But the context of this passage, if you go and read Psalm 46, it's like a battle psalm. It's about battle. It's about being fitted for battle, outfitted for battle, the abilities one has in battle. And then God speaks into the midst of this battle song, and he says, be still. Wait a second, God, somebody's attacking me. I didn't like what they did. Be still. Why? Because God is our defender. When somebody offends us, it's a crossing of a boundary that we've established. We didn't like it, and we feel like we have to make it right. But God's word to us is slow down. Don't say anything yet, because you're going to make it worse. And be still and trust that I am God. And in this, there's actually really good news, because when we allow God to be God, we can recognize that we're not. Again, why? Because whatever's on the other side of that does not produce the righteousness of God. It only serves to separate relationship. So if you want to become unoffendable, you got to let God let God deal with your anger. And the first step of that is slowing down. The second step of that is to prayerfully give it to the Lord, which is really the confession of God. This is what I experienced. I didn't like it, but I trust you to defend me, and I will be still in this moment. I will be still so that you can move, because here's the thing. When we take over God's role, he allows us to take over God's role. God only goes where he's invited, and he doesn't go where he's uninvited. And if I don't invite him into the defense of who I am and what I need, then I'm saying, God, I trust my own ability, and you're not welcome here. God's answer to that is just be still. In the midst of combat, in the midst of this moment where you're charged and ready to go, just be still and invite me into the situation. When we do that, we're going to allow God's anger to take place. And it's weird to say, but God's anger is the thing that produces right relationship. He's the one that has the perspective and the ability to deal with things that you and I cannot. So prayerfully giving it to the Lord is about being still in his presence, laying it out before him, saying, God, this is the story I told about this moment, and I need you to speak into it. I'm pretty charged up. I need your help being still, because I'm about to do something dumb. We need to learn the stillness of God so that he can defend us. And the final step is to choose to overlook. Most of the time we look at offense and we have a couple of responses in our anger. Anger charges us up to attack, or we internalize anger and we allow it to even more quickly push us away from relationship. Either way, it creates a wedge in our relationships. And most of the time we want to confront it. Most of the time we want to deal with the offense. We want to tell somebody, you did something I didn't like. But again, the nature of offense isn't always that somebody did something wrong. They just did something you didn't like. When we confront that, we actually end up creating a bigger problem than we need to. Most of the time, we need to take the words of Proverbs 19:11 to heart, which says, a person's wisdom yields patience. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. The first part of this is actually echoing the process we're walking through. It's slowing down. That's the patience aspect. When you're patient with others, you're viewed as a wise person. These are both relational terms. You and I in relationships we can appear more wise than we are if we just practice patience. If we slow down, you get to be viewed as a wise person. And the other half of this proverb deals with the glory that is added to you when you choose to overlook an offense. Now, glory is about the weight you have. And I'm not talking about your physical weight. Don't worry. This isn't adding pounds to the scale. This is about adding to your reputation of what you're known as. And when we think about it in terms of Scripture, it's even a reflection of who God is. And so it adds to our reputation, it adds to how we're viewed in relationship with others, as well as reflects God's character and power in the world when we choose to overlook an offense. Overlooking an offense has nothing to do with going to the person and telling them what they've done wrong. It's about recognizing it, giving it over to the Lord, and choosing not to act on it. About letting it pass by, not deferring it for a later date so we can pull it out of the backpack and say, do you remember when you did this thing? You did it again, and I didn't like it this time either. That's not overlooking an offense. That's actually just adding it up together so that you have more anger to blast them later. That's like a charge up in a video game. And it takes a long time to do, but it's a powerful punch. Overlooking is actually about letting it go by without the need to engage it, without the need to confront it, without the need to do anything about it. It's to your glory. It's to my glory when we choose to overlook an offense, which also allows us to the understanding that to overlook somebody's offense, it's a choice. It doesn't just happen automatically. You see it, you slow down, you recognize what's going on in your body, you prayerfully give it to the Lord, and then you say, I don't need to do anything about this, which is another way of granting somebody else God's love, grace, and mercy. It's an incredibly merciful act to overlook an offense, to not hold it against somebody. You're not accumulating points. You're not building somebody else's rap sheet against you. You are allowing it to pass by without ever counting it against them. But you don't understand, Dan. Like, they do this all the time. This is a pattern in their life. That's great. The wisdom of this still holds true. It doesn't matter how many times somebody is offensive towards you. It is to your glory to overlook that offense, to let it go by, because guess what? People are going to do offensive things. And they're not always wrong things. They're just things you don't like. They're things I don't like. And you can live life controlled by the thing that actually manifests in your body with clenched teeth that wear it down or cause stress that decreases years off your life. Guess who loses in that scenario? You do. Not the person that caused the offense. It's you, because that's the location of the offense. Every week we've been looking at a different way to build a resilient relationship, and every week we just zoom back in on ourselves because you don't have control over the other half of the relationship. You never do. You have control about self, and that's using the term control very loosely. But you can start to address the things you feel. Step one is really about understanding when you feel that offense, when you feel the symptoms of offense in anger, and choosing not to act on it. Slowing down, prayerfully giving it to the Lord, understanding that He is in the place of judgment and you are not. You don't have the perspective and you don't have the power to make that relationship right. Not in your own anger. And then you have to choose to overlook it. And when you do this, you're going to be viewed as wise. It's going to add to your glory, to your reputation about how you're viewed. I tell you what, I don't want to be viewed as an angry Christian who's just constantly offended by everything. I don't want to allow wedges to creep up in between the world is full of that. I actually want to go back and pick up a quote that I missed at the very beginning of this, and it's from author Brant Hansen, who wrote a book called Unoffendable, and he says this: "Few want to hear this, but it's true, and it can be enormously helpful in life. If you're constantly being hurt, offended, or angry, you should honestly evaluate your inflamed ego." Whew. But you don't understand. They're the ones that offended me. You were in the position to be offended. There is an anger that produces righteousness, that fixes things. It's restorative. You can see it in God's character, but that's not usually what human anger does. Human anger is defensive. It produces a system of defense around our own ego because we didn't like what we felt. That's a selfish anger. We're called to be sacrificial. We're called to pour ourselves out on behalf of others. So it doesn't matter what the world does. It doesn't matter what the opening ceremony in Paris does. You can choose to be offended, or you can choose to overlook an offense. Because the only person who loses in that scenario is you. And then you have no voice to speak into relationship with anybody because you just allow wedges everywhere. You don't get to be a light in the world. You don't get to be helpful to others. You don't get to be restorative. You just get to sit and stew in your anger until you die an early death. Well, that's not fun. Nobody's signing up for that one. Don't sign up for that. It's your choice. But if you can practice this, you're going to start building more resilient relationships where you can work through offense and not allow it to divide you apart. That's what the Bible calls peacemakers. That's what the Bible calls peacemakers, and it's the peacemakers that will be called sons and daughters of God. Why? Because we reflect His character when we become unoffendable. We develop right relationships when we become unoffendable. But the work is inside. I want to pray over you.